What if one of the greatest documentary movies ever made was locked away and I told you that you'll never see it? And that's what we're going to talk about in this video. Recently, there was a 9-hour documentary series produced by Netflix on the story of Prince, directed by Oscar-winner Ezra Edelman. He did the O.J. Simpson film and all those things. He's an amazing director. The film was praised by insiders who saw it, and they called this thing a masterpiece. And yet, the film will never be seen by the public. Why? There's a simple answer to this, but the decision to never let it be seen creates a much more complex situation for filmmakers like you and me. So for those of you who have never heard of Prince, he was an icon of my time, but let me give you the backstory and why he was a legend of his time. All right, Prince was this iconic American music singer and songwriter and multi-instrumentalist. He was widely regarded as one of the most innovative and influential artists of modern music history. He became famous for blending genres that were like funk and rock and pop and R&B and soul, and some of the biggest songs were things like Purple Rain, When Doves Cry, Kiss, and 1999. You should look these up on Spotify. And you can also subscribe to the Grata 7 Films podcast at the same time. So Prince wasn't only a gifted artist and performer, he was also an incredible songwriter and producer. Over his career, he released over 39 studio albums, which is kind of complete insanity. And he wrote thousands of songs, which were never released, and they found those after he died. Prince was also a fierce advocate for artists. He was famously would battle with these studio executives for creative control and ownership. He even changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol during one of these disputes. I mean, it was crazy. You can look all this up. I'm not making this up. Needless to say, this guy's an icon, and he had a huge following. Still does. All right, Prince died of an accidental fentanyl overdose at the age of 57. He was actually taking these pills for chronic pain in his hip from years of performing. He didn't know, according to whatever's out there, he didn't know that it was that the drug was laced with fentanyl. So despite his death in 2016, Prince was a trailblazer, and he redefined music in the music industry. And for many, he still remains as powerful after he's died than he did before. As you can already see, this story has everything that needs to just be an epic film, and an 8-hour film for that, or a series. Now let's talk about The Vault. This is basically a documentary filmmaker's dream. After Prince died, his estate discovered a secret vault in his home in Minnesota. Prince was extremely private about his creative process, and while he occasionally mentioned this vault in interviews, he never detailed its size or what was inside. Most people, it was just this, for majority of his friends even, it was just this myth or a rumor that they knew, but nobody was really sure if it existed. So here's where things get interesting. He had the only key, literally. The vault was bank quality steel and also could be used as a safe room. And Prince was reportedly the only one who knew the passcode. After his death in 2016, they actually had to drill a hole in this thing so that they could get access to it. So the estate kept what was inside very private for years, and it was only when Netflix hired Ezra to do the documentary, he was able to begin researching what was inside. Inside the vault were several unreleased albums, countless hours of performances. However, many of the tapes were edited to take out moments that would give Edelman insight onto how to tell the story. Prince actually edited himself out to make himself look a certain way, I guess. We don't have all the clues here. Ezra spent years researching and following clues to find the right people to interview. However, again, he hit roadblocks. People who were closest to Prince wouldn't tell the story about who he was. Many of those people were his closest friend, and they fiercely guarded his story. But Ezra spent years building trust and sharing his vision, and was finally able to get the interviews that began to show the depth of Prince's personal struggle and challenges and what he had gone through in his life. I can only imagine how much passion and energy Ezra had to put into this. I have a deep compassion for this with what I went through with making Rising from Ashes. Edelman began to put together these rare interviews, behind the scenes footage, and created an honest look at one of music's greatest icons. He spent nearly 5 years working on this film, pouring in his energy, passion, and creative talent into uncovering this side of Prince's life, and he wanted to give the world a picture of fully who Prince was. Despite the fact that Ezra poured his life into this project, Netflix pulled it before anyone could see it. Reportedly, the estate was unhappy with how Prince was portrayed, especially concerning sensitive and potentially controversial subjects. They were uncomfortable with how personal and raw the documentary was. So I would take the liberty to say that they viewed Edelman's film as too unfiltered for their vision of how they wanted to see Prince remembered. But here's the twist that makes the whole thing even more complex. The state has announced that they will be producing its own documentary on Prince, that they have control over the narrative. Reports suggest that the estate's version will represent more controlled narratives, focusing on celebrating Prince's legacy while steering clear of some of the more controversial topics, while Edelman's doc allegedly included. This raises a really important question and why I'm actually recording this thing. Who is able to tell stories? But maybe the question isn't who gets to tell these stories. Maybe the real question is, how honest are we willing to be with audiences about who people really are? Is it okay to show their struggles, mistakes, and their flaws? The things that all of us have. So it's important to mention that I'm only working from Ezra's side of the story, and we have not seen the film. However, the interviews that Ezra's done in podcasts and things like that make it very clear that he was doing his job as a documentary filmmaker and that he deeply cared about Prince and preserving his legacy. He was commissioned to make an honest film, and he told the truth. The question I think we all have to ask as documentary filmmakers is, if we don't show the other side of humanity, our challenges, our flaws, how will the audience perceive themselves? Will they feel that their heroes and legends were perfect, and that's how we all need to portray ourselves and be remembered? So here's the thing I'm thinking about. Audiences are smart. They're catching on. If we tell stories that feel sanitized or inauthentic, people are going to begin to question who you and I are as filmmakers, especially documentary filmmakers. And in a world where trust and truth are becoming more questionable, this already creates a difficult landscape for documentarians. I think people are hungry for authentic, well-told stories. And if you're passionate and prepared, there's space for these voices. So if you're thinking about making a complex documentary, here are 5 things to keep in mind. Access and rights. Start by making sure you have permission to use footage, music, and personal stories, especially if you're covering public figures or someone else. Make sure you have story rights that are documented, that you have control and the ability to tell the story that you want to tell. All right, next is make sure you have control over the story. You need to have clear agreements about who gets final say on the film. You don't want to spend years working on a film only to find out you can't get it released. Now, in this case, I'm sure it was more complex, and when you have people like Netflix and those people involved, I'm sure Edelman did the best he could. All right, the next is legal protections. Think about hiring a lawyer familiar with documentary filmmaking. It can save you a lot of stress and protect you from unexpected legal issues. All right, next is ethical storytelling. Be fair and respectful with your subject. Even when tackling these hard topics, our job is not just to entertain, it's to inform and build trust and tell the truth. The last thing is audience connection. Know who you're making the film for. Are you hoping to inspire people, to ask them to participate in something bigger? Are you hoping to inspire change? Make sure that you know who you're serving and make sure it's the right master. So here's my opinion on the whole thing. The story of the Prince documentary it's a really powerful reminder of how complex storytelling can be. I think the estate made a big mistake. Humans have this unique capacity for compassion and empathy as long as they're presented with the truth. At least that's what we've experienced. I think deep down we all understand that we're not perfect and that we all need grace and understanding. I think Ezra's documentary would have not only celebrated Prince's life, but given the audience a deeper understanding of who he was and would have allowed us to appreciate him for decades to come. But I also have one unanswered question. What did Prince want? How did he want us to remember him? I don't have the answer to this. So what do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments, like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.